Today I'm in Texas dodging the raindrops in the sky and the fire ants in the ground because I was finally able to get hands-on with the most important vehicle in the Genesis lineup. It's the Genesis GV80, and for 2025 it's received a pretty thorough refresh. For a luxury car, that is, because clearly they wanted this to still look like a GV80. And that's logical, because it accounts for a full third of all Genesis models sold in North America, and that means it was important that they get it right. So did they? Well, let's take a look. Although not technically the flagship of the brand, that would be the G90 sedan, the GV80 is logically the reason that a huge number of Genesis shoppers were even interested in Genesis to begin with. And that appeal is going to broaden even further because there's going to be a GV80 coupe coming very soon for someone that wants something, maybe a little bit crossover meets sedan. We'll talk about that a little bit in this video, but stay tuned for a full look at that coming soon. Because of its importance, it was really critical that Genesis not alienate existing Genesis shoppers, and that's why the front-end tweaks are relatively minor. And unless you parked this next to a 2024 GV80, you'd be forgiven if you didn't quite notice all the changes. The grille becomes a dual-line weave. It's sort of a basket weave design, but with dual lines rather than single bars like we found in the previous model. The lower grille becomes a little bit angrier, and a bigger change happens with the headlights. We still find that twin-line design that we find all the way around the GV80, but now we find 9 separate LED modules inside each of these headlamp arrays, so 18 on each side. The Genesis logo is now done in a metal finish, and there is tons of chrome up front. Don't worry, if you were looking for sort of that mini Bentley look, it's still definitely here. When the rumors started swirling that Genesis was going to create their very first SUV, a lot of folks were intrigued and rumors started swirling. Was Genesis going to go in the same direction as Acura and Lexus and base their SUV off of a more mainstream product? Or were they going to go in the direction that they had been going, where they were targeting more of the European competition directly? And the answer is the latter. That's one of the big differentiators between the GV80 and an MDX or a Lexus RX. This has a long hood up front, not because it looks cute like we find in some Acura models, but because it's actually housing a rear-wheel drive based drivetrain. Even though all GV80s are all-wheel drive by default, it is a rear-wheel drive based drivetrain, so very much the same design that we find in a Mercedes GLE and a BMW X5. So it should be no surprise that dimensionally, the GV80 is almost exactly the same size as that BMW or the Mercedes. It's about 2 inches longer than the Lexus RX, and a little bit shorter than some of those 3-row competitors that you might want to cross-shop this against. The design definitely is a little bit more 2-row than 3-row, although we do find a window right here. That's because you can get this with a teeny tiny 3rd row. There is going to be a larger 3-row vehicle in the Genesis lineup at some point. In the meantime, this is the only 3-row model in the line. But one thing you should know is that the roofline is definitely lower than the BMW or the Mercedes. That gives this sleeker look, but it does mean that if you do plan on getting that tiny optional 3rd row, it is notably smaller than some of the competition. Now, if you're interested in the coupe that's coming a little bit later, it's going to be about 1 inch longer, mainly because when they dropped the roofline, they didn't want it to look funny, and so they actually had to add a little bit of extra bumper length in order to make that design flow. The dual bar design theme continues from the headlights to the turn signals right by the side view mirror, all the way back here to the taillights that wrap from the rear onto the side. No refresh would be complete without new wheel designs, so of course we find those here as well. But we don't get wider tires. That was one thing I had sort of expected for 2025. Now keep in mind these are still pretty wide at 265/40 R22s, but I had sort of hoped that maybe the 3.5-liter turbo model would get a modest fender flare and maybe some wider tires to help this compete with some of those higher-end X5s and GLEs. Now, if you are looking for better performance and better handling in your Genesis, just hang tight, because the Magma concepts they showed in New York are definitely pointing the direction that the brand is going to go in. At the moment, however, you'll notice that although we do have a strong shoulder design, it's not quite as muscular, not quite as bulgy as we find in the BMW and the Mercedes, especially those upper-end trims. Instead, Genesis is going for more of a flowing, luxurious design, and I think they've really achieved that. I also am intrigued that down here, instead of faux exhaust tips, we have sort of the same sort of Superman shield thing going on up front in sort of the location that you would find an exhaust tip. I actually am much happier about that than the faux exhaust tips we find in a lot of Audis. At the moment, you'll find two different engines under this hood. The base engine is one of the most powerful base engines in this segment, 300 horsepower, 311 pound-feet from a 2.5-liter 4-cylinder turbo. That's also the most efficient way to get the GV80, 19 miles per gallon city, 24 on the highway. This engine, however, is the most fun way to get the GV80. This is a 3.5-liter twin-turbo 6 that bumps power up to 375 horsepower, torque up to 391. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking, hang on, it has an extra liter and 2 extra cylinders, but that horsepower and torque bump don't seem significant. What gives? Well, it's mainly about the way that power is delivered. Not only is this 6-cylinder engine quieter and smoother than the 2.5-liter 4-cylinder, it is going to be notably quicker 0 to 60 because the horsepower and the torque happen at lower RPMs. That's how this goes 0 to 60 in 5.8 seconds, whereas it takes the 2.5-liter turbo about 6.5 seconds to accomplish that same task. Both engines are mated to a standard 8-speed automatic transmission and standard all-wheel drive. If you get the 3.5-liter turbo, we get a limited slip differential in the back. So this is going to be the most sure-footed way to get the GV80. Important if you live in an area where you're worried about winter weather traction. This has the ability not just to send 100% of engine power to the rear axle, but also up to 50% of engine power to the front, even though there's no slip in the back. And then of course it can effectively lock that rear axle if it needs to. It's an E-limited slip differential in the back to really help improve that winter weather traction. That makes this drivetrain again more similar to an X5's than a Lexus RX. Now if you want even more power in the coupe version, we're going to get the same engine with the E-supercharger system that is going to bump power up even further. Like we see in some other Genesis models, the front seats are a blend of European and Japanese sensibilities. We get more seat motion and more seat configuration options than we'd find in a Lexus: 4-way adjustable lumbar, inflatable bolsters, an inflatable seat bottom cushion, and extending thigh cushion, all memory linked to this tilt telescopic powered steering column and front seat massage for the driver. If you're the front passenger, you don't get a lot of those features. You don't get the massage, the extending thigh cushion, the inflatable bottom cushion, or the inflatable bolsters. Now, that does make sense because not only does omitting that particular feature set from the passenger seat lower costs, it also has the potential of increasing reliability long term. But it does mean that if you want the front passenger to have massage and the same level of adjustability, you're going to have to look at one of those European products. Hopping into the back, there is tons of room. This front seat's adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, and as you can see, I still have about 4 or 5 inches of legroom left. You'd have no problem fitting some of those larger rear-facing child seats back here. Now, due to the design of the GV80, we do get a driveline hump, of course, in the middle, but it's not as pronounced as I had expected. It's only maybe about 4 inches tall or so a little bit lower than some of the German competition. Headroom, however, is not quite as generous as some. Right here in the middle, I benefit from this big glass moonroof, but if I move out to the outboard seating position, then my head is more over this fabric section, and if I had this second row seat in more of a natural upright seating position, I have maybe about an inch of headroom left. Keep in mind that the BMW and the Mercedes have a little bit more of a higher roofline design, so a bit boxier theme, and that is going to improve practicality in the second row. However, this is still a really practical second row because we get not just a fold-down armrest there, but if I can find the button, there it is, there is also a 40-20-40 folding rear seat design. I love the practicality of this. It means that if you want to put longer items like skis in here, or you just want to go to IKEA and get a bookcase, it's going to be a lot easier to put it in the back. Now, in terms of child seat anchors, we have latch anchors for the outboard seating positions, but we have top tether anchors for all 3. In the center console for the rear passengers, we find air vents up here, controls for the 3-zone automatic climate control, not a 4-zone system like we find in some of the competition. On the other hand, we have ventilated and heated rear seats, USB-C charge ports back here, and 150 watts of AC inversion. There's a better look of that driveline hump. As you can see, it's not overly tall. Depending on the trim level you get, you'll either get manual or power folding second row seats. This has the power folding design. They are a little bit slower than I would like. I think I would probably just stick with the manual seats if I had a choice. They also slide forward and backward to give you a bit more cargo room if you need it in the back. And of course, if you get the 3-row model, this is where the 3rd row would go. This model, on the other hand, is the 2-row model, so instead of a 3rd row, we get an enormous cargo area back here. There are also some buttons to power fold and unfold the 2nd row right there. We dig under the floor mat here. We find a place where you can store the the roller cargo cover. I appreciate the fact that they've given us a slot for that. There's also some additional storage space there for things like that cargo net. If I go ahead and pop those back into place, I think it's a little bit silly that those are designed like that. We have an enormous cargo well here because, of course, we don't get that third row. Going even further down the rabbit hole, you'll notice that there is in fact a place to mount a spare tire. That's because in some world markets the GV80 will get one, but here we get this divider in the back, or we get the third row. The biggest change happens inside, so I'm just going to pan across the dashboard before we get into the details so you can see how it all comes together. The dashboard has received a pretty radical redesign, but the seats and the doors, those remain about the same. This model has the large panoramic moonroof that you're going to find on most GV80s out there. It's a dual pane design where we find a front pane that opens and a back pane that remains stationary, although you can close both of them off with the sunshade. We also have these mirrors back here for rear seat passengers. Pardon me for looking at them the wrong way around. And you'll notice that this model also has the active noise cancellation system, so we have various microphones around the ceiling. Most models will also have rear window shades. They're powered in this trim. Up here we have height adjustable shoulder belts and two-way adjustable headrests for the driver and front passenger. The general design of the door panels is pretty similar to before, but there are a few important changes, the most noticeable of which is probably going to be the Bang & Olufsen audio system with the metal speaker grills up front. Also the trim, which we're going to cover in just a little bit. Now, as far as the color goes, this is a two-tone interior design. We have lots of soft touch materials, including the entire lower section of the door, stitched materials in the midsection of the door, soft armrests, and then the stitched upper section of the door panel as well. This shows a little bit more green on your screen than it really looks in person. This is kind of a charcoal meets really dark navy green, something along those lines. Depending on who's looking at it and the lighting at the time, it can either look gray or it can look ever so slightly green. I think this is a really good look for Genesis, going in a different direction and not just crafting the interior out of one huge block of black plastic. We have a stitched upper section of the dashboard, soft touch midsection, and even soft touch plastics lower on the dashboard as well. Nice big bin style glove compartment right there, although it is a little bit too small for an 11-inch tablet computer. Now, speaking of tablet computers, we have this absolutely enormous, nearly 30-inch OLED display in the dashboard. This is not a two-screen setup like we've seen from Genesis for a while. This is actually a single screen, and you will probably notice it most if we exit out of Apple CarPlay integration and look at the native screens. You can see that this really does make use of that design. I think it actually makes better use of this single screen layout than we find in some Cadillac products, where in most of the screen views there's kind of an artificial seam in the software that really belies the fact that you just have one huge display. Now, speaking of CarPlay and Android Auto, that will be wireless eventually. They have said that the hardware will support it, but that feature is going to come a few months later. So if you buy an early production GV80, you will get wired smartphone integration. Wireless smartphone integration will happen via an over-the-air update a little bit later in the year. Now, over here on this side, we also find some refreshed software for the LCD instrument cluster. That's also a welcome change. It's a little bit more feature-rich than before. The design's going to change a little bit based on the various drive modes you're in. You can see that we get that big screen mapping interface there, and it does kind of spread across the display. So if I swipe over here to the home screen, you'll notice that the mapping layout actually changes a little bit right there, and it will use both sides of the screen. You can also adjust these various widgets in the screen and then get a slightly different look for the speedometer and tachometer over there. And moving back out from there, back towards the center console, let's talk about this trim. This is actually recycled newspaper. You can actually see that this is not a monochromatic design. There are actually colors in there, and if you look closely, you can even see letters from the newsprint. They processed it in layers, sort of glued it all together, cut it at an angle, and then they polished it and used it as if it were wood trim in the vehicle. It really gives us a very distinctive look, and this is not the only car for 2025 that is going to get this kind of treatment on the dashboard. We're also going to be seeing this in the new Cadillac Optic, interestingly enough. Here we have a touchscreen control for the climate control system and a small LCD in the middle of that. The touch buttons give you haptic feedback, but it's not the most aggressive feedback that I've seen. And then we have some physical controls for things like the temperature setting there and the volume knob as well. Moving down from there, we find a storage area for your smartphone. This is where we find the USB interface. There's also a USB charge only port, Qi wireless charging mat. That's going to be important once this supports wireless CarPlay, and a 12-volt power port. In case you're wondering what the key looks like, it looks like this, pretty much the same as the rest of the Genesis lineup. We find lots of that sort of wood-like trim going down here, down the center console. This is the controller knob for the infotainment system. You can either touch it or you can use this controller knob with some dedicated buttons there in front of it. We have a fingerprint sensor for turning the vehicle on, also adjusting some of the vehicle preferences. Sort of like seat memory settings taken to the next level. Over here we have the auto brake hold button, then we have the rotary style shifter. This always returns to center. So drive there, it returns center, reverse there, it returns center. Park is that button in the front. That really makes 3-point turns actually pretty quick, because just flick it side to side for 3-point turns. 2 big cup holders. Currently there's a Sony lens in one. Behind that we have the drive mode selector, a lock for the center coupling. Remember, this is a rear-wheel drive vehicle. The center armrest features a bifold design. The release is right up front. It pops open like that. And then we have a relatively shallow storage tray that is removable, and then a much deeper storage well under that. But keep in mind, this is still a rear-wheel drive based vehicle. So the transmission and the rear climate control, it's all under that section right there. So it's not going to be quite as deep as some of those front-wheel drive based competitors. Back on the driver's side of the vehicle, we find a 3-spoke steering wheel with a wrapped airbag cover. That's a really elegant touch, and a 2-tone design matching what's going on in the rest of the interior. Shift paddles on the back, and of course the stalks behind that. And then here we find all physical buttons, so no touch buttons, thank heavens. I am not the biggest fan of the Mercedes trend of touch buttons and the touch controller, although we do have a little touch controller over here for interacting with that multifunction LCD cluster. I think that could have been done perhaps a little bit better. There are a few features that will use it, but not every feature is going to use that. So if I, for instance, toggle over here to get some of the different layouts and looks on this display, you'll notice we have a 2-dial display. We can also roll through a mode where we have little widgets on the side. And if we do have the widgets on the side, then we use this button here to control those widgets, to open them and close them, to scroll back through them, very much like we use the Mercedes scroll touch thing. Thanks to the OLED design, this doesn't need a binnacle in order to keep it readable in strong sunlight. I had no problem out here in Texas getting a good view, even in some really challenging lighting conditions. Above that, we have a full color heads-up display. It's quite a large one. And then in the middle, we have the speaker grill for the center channel speaker array. This is the big difference. The Bang & Olufsen sound system has fewer speakers than the previous generation system. Apparently, in this module, there is just one speaker. According to the audio engineers I was able to speak with, because these speakers are firing up at the glass, they didn't actually see any difference between one speaker in there and the previous 4-speaker array, so that's the big difference in the speaker count. Moving back up to the infotainment screen, we see one of the other changes for 2025. Well, actually, we can see, hear, and smell the change for 2025, because this is what Genesis calls the mood Curator. Sorry, I can't spit that out. We get some animations there. We also get the smelly system spraying some smell things. We get the ambient lighting and some tunes playing. And then you can choose between these various different moods that you might want to experience while driving. Fragrances are definitely a big thing in the luxury space, so if you want to control those fragrances yourself, there's a button down here in the climate control screen as well. One quick digression. How do the scent cartridges work? Well, here's what they look like. The vehicle can hold 2 scent cartridges at a time. In this one, we have My Favorite Place and we have The Driver's Awakening. Those are the 2 scent cartridges that we have in the vehicle at the moment. They actually have little contacts on the back so that way the vehicle can actually interact with them, and they go right inside the glove compartment. There's a special little compartment that was tricky to show on camera, so I'm not going to try to, but they're up there in the glove compartment, and then you can swap them at your leisure, or you can just choose not to have one at all. If you're looking for an interior that's a little bit darker and maybe is going to hide the dirt a little bit more easily, you could take a look at this brown interior if you don't want to go full on charcoal. It's still a 2-tone design. We have this sort of mid-chestnut brown leather for the seats, and then moving over to the doors and the dashboard, we actually find the same upper color that we found in that sort of ivory and green interior, only in this interior it actually looks more charcoal than it does in that other one, but it's actually the exact same color. Same soft touch materials all the way up and down the dashboard, but we have a very different design to the trim in this vehicle. If I were shopping for a GV80, this is the color combo that I would get. I really like the 2-tone steering wheel design, but especially on the steering wheel, that ivory color is going to show dirt a lot more easily. All right, it's time to get the GV80 out on the road. The first thing obviously you're going to notice, especially if you're comparing this against an MDX or an RX, is the rear-wheel drive based drivetrain. And yes, all-wheel drive is standard, but the reason I keep saying rear-wheel drive is because it feels very much like that out on the road. Whether you're going around a corner like that with maybe just quarter throttle on, or whether you're all the way to the floor, this has a strong rear power bias, and it makes it a lot more fun than the RX and even more fun than the MDX. Yes, the MDX with super handling all-wheel drive can send up to 70% of power to the rear axle, but that's not 70% of maximum power. It does make the rear end swing around a little bit in the MDX, but nothing like this. Now, they decided not to tune this to be as tail happy as some BMW or Mercedes models can be, and that's because obviously they're trying to attract a customer that maybe is used to an RX or an MDX, but they want something that's a little bit more fun. And I think that was the exact right thing to do. In steady state neutral travel, especially if we're in the eco mode, it's going to send most of the power to the rear. Until there's wheel slip, of course, then it can send power up front. And you can command a lock of the center coupling with the lock button right there in the middle. It's of course a multi-plate clutch pack in the middle, and then we have the E-limited slip differential in this 3.5 liter turbocharged version. Regardless of the drive mode, as long as the engine is already on, this will run 0 to 60 in 5.7 to 5.8 seconds pretty much every single time. The timing out here in northern Texas is going to be a little bit different than the last numbers I got at home, because right now we're out about 1,000 feet and it's around 80 degrees outside, even though it is raining out there. So obviously that's going to affect the 0 to 60 time. Be sure and stay tuned, because hopefully we'll have one of these at home so we can run it through our full battery of tests just as soon as possible. That's probably also why the 60 to 0 stopping distance is a little bit different than last time. It took 118 feet for this to stop from 60 back to 0. This does not have summer tires on it, and the 265 width tires are notably narrower than the last X5 I drove. That's probably why there's going to be that variance there. Again, there may be higher performance models of this coming at some point soon, but not at the moment. Now keep in mind that when it comes to steering and suspension tuning, Genesis tends to march to a slightly different drummer than especially the European alternatives. This is a little bit tighter, a little bit more direct feeling than the Lexus, also than the MDX, but it's not quite as sporty feeling, I guess you'd say, as something like a BMW X5 or a Mercedes-Benz GLC. Those are a little bit smaller than this and more direct competition to the GV70, but value proposition-wise, for a comparably equipped X3 or GLC, you'd actually be paying GV80 money. So you could step up into the next category, still have rear-wheel drive driving dynamics, have some more interior room, and a more premium feeling vehicle for about the same kind of cash. Exactly how this lines up against the German competition really depends on exactly which German competitor we're talking about. Size-wise, this is more like a BMW X5, but driving dynamics-wise, I would actually say sometimes it feels a little bit more like an X3. This drives smaller than you might think, especially if you're comparing this against a Mercedes or a BMW with the adaptive air suspension. That's a feature we do not find on the GV80. This has an adaptive suspension, but it's not an air-sprung suspension, so it doesn't have that sort of floaty-boaty, wallowy feel that you can sometimes get in the Mercedes and the BMW. Now on the downside, that means this suspension is not going to be as comfortable as some versions of the X5, but on the upside, it means it's actually going to be a little bit more dynamic. At the moment, I'm in the comfort suspension mode because it soaks up the bumps and the dips and the whoops in this road the best, but I could move this over to the sport mode. The suspension is really going to firm up notably. The steering is going to have a little bit more heft to it, but not a whole lot more feel. It's definitely more engaging on this road surface, however. Also helping out the driving dynamics in the GV80 is a lower center of gravity, and that's because we don't have quite as much ground clearance as we find in some of the competition, especially if you're going to compare this against, again, that X5 with the air springs, or some of the entries from the Land Rover lineup, which you could definitely see as direct competition to this, something like a Range Rover Velar, something along those lines. Price-wise, it's going to be right here in this category, or a bit more expensive, but dynamically, I think I would choose the Genesis. Bear in mind that I'm not driving this at home, so I don't have official cabin noise or fuel economy scores yet, but the last GV80 that we did test at home performed quite well when it came to cabin noise. The X5 is a little bit quieter, as is the Mercedes-Benz GLE, but this was actually quieter than the MDX or the RX, and Genesis says they've added some additional refinement for 2025. The one thing they haven't done is address the fuel economy, and that's one area where the GV80, and actually most of the Genesis lineup, has actually lagged Acura and especially Lexus. There's no hybrid version of this. Genesis has said that they're exploring more hybrid and plug-in hybrid options now, But at the moment, there is no hybrid version of the GV80. And if you want 375 horsepower, you're going to have to pay the piper. Out here in Texas so far, we've been averaging about 17 miles per gallon. That is definitely below what we've seen in the BMW X5 with the 3-liter inline-6 engine, obviously below the Mercedes GLE and the Lexus, especially the Lexus hybrid. If you want fantastic fuel economy, you want the RX hybrid. But on the other hand, it's not going to be anywhere near as dynamic as this. You also aren't going to get the rear-wheel drive dynamic because even in the RX 500h, which has the improved rear axle design, it actually still is not sending a great deal of power to the rear. And this is a very different driving dynamic. While we're stuck in traffic, you might be wondering, why doesn't Genesis simply grab a Hyundai hybrid system and jam one under the hood for better fuel economy? Well, there are a few good reasons why not to. The first one, obviously, is they think it would be wrong for the brand. A lot of people make fun of the Lexus ES and the Lexus RX because they share hybrid systems with other Toyota models. The other reason is actually a bit more direct, and it's that those hybrid systems simply would not fit in this Genesis. And that's because this is a rear-wheel drive vehicle, and those are front-wheel drive hybrid systems never designed for this particular dedicated rear-wheel drive platform when they were currently designed. So that's why we don't find them in here. There are two notable things about Genesis that I've long appreciated. The first one is they're not afraid to make bold decisions. The second thing is, when it doesn't go right, they're not afraid to change their mind either. And I think it's important that those two things go hand in hand. Case in point, the relatively unusually styled steering wheel that we first saw in the GV80. That wasn't exactly everybody's preference, and it is notably absent in this generation. They decided to go ahead and remove that, put a more traditional steering wheel design on the vehicle. Then there's the steering tuning and the suspension tuning. They definitely take feedback from owners, from prospective owners, and from journalists as well, and then they continually dial in and refine the product. Sometimes in very quick order. Sometimes it doesn't really take Genesis 4 years or Hyundai 4 years to make some of these adjustments. They really want to tackle these things relatively rapidly, and that's not what we see in all of the competition, especially the Japanese competition, where maybe there's kind of a funky thing going on in the Lexus RX and a lot of people don't like it, like that infotainment controller, but then it continues on and continues on and continues on, even though the car has received an interior refresh. We don't see quite that in the Genesis lineup, but they're still a relatively conservative company, so they don't think too far out the box, and I think that's exactly the right balance for a luxury car like this. Now let's talk about pricing. Generally speaking, it's going to be easier to explain on the GV80 than the European competition because there are fewer standalone options. You choose your engine and then you choose your package on top of it. But there is one quirk. When this goes on sale, right around the time that you're watching this video, the least expensive model is going to be the all-wheel drive trim. Remember, I said all-wheel drive is standard on every GV80 in the US and in Canada. That's going to cost you $60,050, including destination, for one of the more powerful base entries in this segment. Also, one of the best equipped options. You're going to get the leatherette upholstery, heated front seats, heated steering wheel, the rear window shades, the fingerprint reader, and almost all of the active safety systems that are available on the GV80. But confusingly, coming a few months later, there's going to be a new base trim that's going to be $1,000 less expensive, but it's still going to have all-wheel drive. So yes, you don't have to step up to the all-wheel drive trim to get all-wheel drive. I have no idea why that is. Genesis did not have a good explanation. Don't rack your brain trying to figure it out. If you want to add leather seats, the panoramic moonroof, the Bang & Olufsen audio system, and a number of other key features, you want to add the advanced package on that model. That's going to be $6,900 extra. The Premier package is going to be nearly $12,000 extra, but it's going to bring with it everything that's on that advanced package, plus adaptive suspension system and the heated and ventilated seats as well. Also, 22-inch alloy wheels. If you want the extra power and the extra smoothness of the V6 engine, you're going to have to pay at least $75,150. That's mainly because the advanced package feature set becomes standard on the 3.5-liter turbo model. Now, if you want a fully loaded version, which is what we're looking at today, that's going to mean the Prestige package has to be added for $5,500. And if you add on the optional matte paint job, which this does not have, that's going to bring the total up to $82,150, including destination. That price range is wider than we find in the Lexus lineup, and of course the Acura lineup as well, but narrower than most of the Europeans, because the Mercedes especially can get wicked expensive if you get carried away with options. And a lot of the features that are standard on the Genesis are optional on the European competitors. So when it comes to this versus the BMW or the Mercedes, the play is value. This may actually be more expensive than an X5 or a GLE, depending on the configuration you're looking at, but you're going to get a ton more equipment on your Genesis. Versus an RX or an MDX, this is unquestionably more expensive, but you're getting a more premium, more luxurious vehicle. I think a lot of it is going to come down to what kind of badge do you want on the front of your luxury car. If you really want an Acura badge or a Lexus badge, then I'm probably not going to change your mind. But if you're open to something else, you will find a more premium, more dynamic, faster accelerating, better handling, and better equipped vehicle in the Genesis than in the Lexus lineup, especially versus the new RX. This interior feels considerably more luxurious than what we find in the current generation RX. There's a reason the RX is less expensive, because it just has a less expensive interior. Now, versus those European competitors, that's going to come down to how much do you care about long-term maintenance and repair costs. Those are going to be lower in the Genesis. It has a longer warranty than a lot of the competition. We also, generally speaking, have better reliability and maintenance figures long-term on this than a BMW or a Mercedes. But the BMW and Mercedes are, generally speaking, going to handle a bit better, and they're going to perform a bit better, especially if you look at those more powerful engine options. Let me know what you would pick down there in the comments section. If my money were on the line and I did not need a third row, this would solidly be at the top of my list. If I did need the third row, your option set is really going to shrink. You could wait for the upcoming 3-row Genesis, which is going to have a really big third row, or you could get something like an MDX or an XC90. Just know that you're going to be giving up the infotainment system that we find in here, the front seat comfort and design that we find in here, and the more premium materials and better dynamic handling that we find in the GV80 versus the MDX and the XC90. They're no slouches, but they're also no GV80. On the other hand, the X5 and the GLE, those have slightly larger third rows. They are definitely going to come in forms that are better handling and faster accelerating, etc. But you're going to be paying a pretty decent premium for that, not just in the initial purchase price, but also in long-term maintenance and dependability. So let me know down there what you would pick, and be sure and stay tuned for the full review of the GV80 coming soon. We can get this at home, and of course the GV80 Coupe, which hopefully we'll be driving shortly. That is theoretically going to have a more powerful e-supercharged engine under the hood that's going to bump power up a little bit beyond this 3.5-liter turbo. I'll see all of you later.